I'm Dr. Arlene Gehmacher, ROM's Curator of Canadian Art. Thanks so much for joining us for Curator Conversation. That's our new digital program that explores various themes and subjects from across ROM collections alongside industry professionals. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. In a few minutes, we will broadcast a pre-recorded conversation between me and Vancouver-based artist Karin Jones. Karin's initial career path from 1993 was in goldsmithing, but since 2007, she has been more interdisciplinary in her practice. Today, we consider in greater detail her installation piece, Worn, the context of its making and its impact. Hi, Karin. Nice to see you today. Thank you for joining us from Vancouver.
Yeah, nice to see you too. It's a pleasure.
I thought we'd take this opportunity to be able to maybe expand on one of the projects you did for the ROM, Worn, Shaping a Black Feminine Identity. And just to give a bit of the background for the people who weren't able to see that, it was a project that you created specifically for the ROM, site-specific, in the Canada Gallery, as a response to either the absence or presence of Black Canadians within that very historical narrative that is the Canada Gallery. It consists primarily of 18th and 19th century artifacts. And so you were an intervention, your piece was an intervention in that particular circumstance. I remember when you wrote your text, there's always a word limit in an exhibit presentation. Yeah. And I was just astounded at how substantive that text was. But at the same time, I just wanted to ask more questions. And I thought this would be a really great opportunity for us to talk about some of that. The cotton bowls on the floor, the reference to the economy and building the wealth of the British Empire. I think that's something that a lot of people understood fairly immediately. Is that your sense of that also?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I like that installation was actually a marriage of two ideas that I had, and I can't remember which I had first, but I had the idea for doing the dress made of the braided hair extensions. And then I had sort of a vision of these cotton bowls where I'd remove the cotton itself and put some of my own hair in it, because I was thinking about the idea of our identities and how and when they're created, and really feeling like, because that historical narrative of slavery is such a strong one in North America, it automatically gets attached to the identities of Black people living in North America. So I was kind of wanting to show that my hair growing out of the cotton is like a symbol of my identity growing out of being born in those fields. And so, so I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with that. But then when this opportunity for an installation came up, I thought I would scatter them around. And it really just, I think it helps people to see the connection between the textile industry and the cotton in the fields and slavery that is also present in the dress. But I think it helped to strengthen that, hopefully, for people to see the connection a bit more strongly.
It was a very powerful metaphor. I mean, the whole piece is basically.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think many people were very much engaged with it when it was on display at the ROM in that particular moment. It's on display now, but even back at that particular moment, it was very powerful. You also mentioned Sarah Bartmann, and she's been. I think she's more in our consciousness now. There have been books and articles written about her, but it would be really great if we could expand on some of the ideas about Sarah Bartmann and how about her importance and impact on your own thinking and on Worn itself.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I also just wanted to mention, in case I forget, that there is a feature-length film that was made a few years ago that I just noticed has just showed up on Netflix. If anyone's interested in watching it, it's called Black Venus, and it's about Sarah Bartmann and her story. And so, just in a nutshell, she was a woman from like the southern area of Africa in the early 1800s who apparently was, this white man came and offered her, supposedly he was going to offer her work as a domestic worker in Europe, but he ended up bringing her to Europe and touring her around as sort of a circus sideshow. At the time, it was popular to have these shows and like human zoos and displays of other cultures, but somehow displaying that culture in the framework of how the Europeans saw them. So he created this sideshow of her, showing her as this primitive African woman, and the like the iconography that was created out of that. She had apparently fairly large buttocks when you see images, engravings of her, and the Europeans were just fascinated with her large buttocks, and they were like disgusted but also titillated, and it's a really kind of horrific story how she was mocked, and but also like became this icon of what became a symbol of animalistic sexuality that often still gets attached to Black people and Black women in a particular way. And so if you Google her, you'll see lots of awful cartoons of these men with these little opera glasses looking at her buttocks and everything. And I just really think that's still so present in our culture today. And so the connection that I was making was, although they talked about her as this disgusting symbol of primitive cultures, also you'll see when you look at European fashion over the course of the 1800s, I can't help but make the connection between how the bustle in European dresses got bigger and bigger over those decades following her fame in Europe. And so I actually started working on some large scale drawings of the silhouette of Sarah Bartmann. There's a very famous drawing of her in profile, her body from the side, and then also a silhouette of a European lady in a dress with a big bustle, and they're in silhouette and they're facing each other. I never finished the drawings, but I actually ended up making this pair of brooches.
So Karin, so this predates Warren. This piece.
Yes, yeah. So I started working on the drawings towards the end of my last year, or the end of the first year of my MFA program.
Yeah.
I was working on those drawings and thinking about the sort of interplay between Europeans and Africans as symbolized by this European woman and this African woman. And around that same time, I had the idea for doing Warren. So those ideas are all kind of intermingled. And the brooches the brooches I made before I was commissioned to do Warren, but the ideas were already both in my head at the same time.
So what I found interesting, you titled the brooches Pride and Shame.
Mm-hmm.
And they're based on, the silhouettes are based on, as you said, drawings. They're also lithographs from the time of Sarah Bartmann, and of course, advertising some of the shows that she was in for entertainment. And I think it's one of those silhouettes that you based your silhouette of Sarah Bartmann on. And she's in direct face to face with the Victorian woman. Mm-hmm. And what I found really interesting was, first of all, when I saw the title, I just thought, just the pride and shame, and then I'm thinking Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's novel. Was that sort of was that sort of in the back of your mind, just the sort of the rhythm and the pacing of how it comes off? And you say,
I don't think I was thinking about it at the time that I named them, but I've definitely thought of it since then, and especially because I haven't thought that much about those brooches until I sent you the image a few days ago, and I was starting to think about them again, and also thinking about that connection. It was more of a coincidental one, I think, because I was thinking more about my emotions, mixed emotions of pride and shame, in both sides of my heritage, because I am part African and part European, and how those feelings intermingle in a really uncomfortable way, and how I'd also like people of other cultures to think about how those feelings of pride and shame might affect how they see themselves in today's world based on historical narratives that have been created.
It's interesting. I see them. They're two brooches, but I see them as one piece, and they always have to be worn together because
Exactly.
they're completely in dialogue with one another. And it's interesting. From my perspective, I was curious about the whole idea of the voice, and who was saying what word to whom, and it's that sort of multivalence in your work that I find so engaging, and it just makes you, it's so meaningful and provocative in that way that just gets you thinking, and you're never really quite sure where you are, how you position yourself to it, and it's really wonderful. And yeah, so it'll be interesting to see if you actually you start thinking about it differently, or just pick it up and develop it, or
and it's also interesting sometimes when you create a work with a certain intention and you look at it a few years later, and then it can even reveal other meanings that you didn't think of at the time, because like I also have been reading the book White Fragility recently. Right now I'm still reading it.
Yeah.
And in that book, she talks a lot about the, how Europeans have always positioned the African as like the extreme opposite of how they see themselves, which obviously I was aware of as well, but reading this book is getting me thinking about it even more, and thinking about how Europeans always present themselves as like the highest form of culture and civilization, and they always position the African as the lowest, and so they see themselves as opposites. Maybe not specifically. I mean, if you asked a European what they thought of Africans, I'm sure they wouldn't say, oh, an African is my opposite. I'm making it clear that I'm not talking about people's actual consciousness about it, but that's how it's been presented over the course of time. And so when I look at these brooches now, I think about that too, like the thinking about how the woman, the European woman, is clothed, which is always considered a symbol of something that's more advanced or more civilized, and then a naked person is always considered primitive. And so there are lots of other meanings that come up as well.
Well, I think that's one of the wonderful things about time as time goes on, because all of a sudden you do bring other perspectives that you yourself have, and other people bring their own meanings or understandings of it because of personal experiences within their own lives, and it just makes for a very, very rich experience. I was interested in your top hat, your nappy top hat that you made, which the ROM has recently acquired. I'm so happy about that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it too. Yeah.
I'm interested. That predated Worn, is that right?
It did. Yes. Yeah.
So, can you talk a bit about it? Because what I'm interested in is the idea I mean, worn, the dress is so female oriented, gender specific, and the top hat is theoretically very male specific, and yet you've basically taken it as your own. And we can talk a bit about that photograph of you wearing both the dress and the top hat. But it would be interesting to hear how the whole idea that was in the top hat came to inform how you approached worn.
Yeah, I guess I was, because the idea for the top hat came out of thinking about, like what are, like, I guess I was reading a lot about hair in African and African American cultures, and how a lot of these hairstyles are kind of a symbol of power. Like some of them are so intricate, and they can indicate people's social status and everything. And I guess I was thinking about European symbols of power and wealth, and trying to kind of commingle those two different cultures in something that could represent symbols of power in both cultures. And a lot of my research, because I was also, my main focus at the time was actually thinking about hair, and also thinking about how ideas of femininity have been created over time. And so I was reading a lot about how ideas of European femininity were developed, and how that was developed in opposition to African culture, as like African women being seen as not feminine. And yeah, so a lot of my research was leading me back to the Victorian era, because I think that was a time of great cross-cultural exchange. And I think it seems to me that's the time when a lot of stereotypes of other cultures were actually created. And so the top hat works within that framework. And then obviously it led me to, I was looking at a lot of Victorian fashion plates and everything when I was thinking about how ideas of femininity were created. So that kind of led into thinking about making a Victorian dress.
So the picture of you, I'm curious to hear what the experience was for you to actually wear that dress and the top hat.
Yeah.
It's I know you made the dress. You braided the synthetic hair and sewed it, and I know you sewed the braids. You braided the hair onto the top hat substrate, and then you wore it. So it was. I guess what I'm asking is, the difference in experience between making it and that intensity of making both those pieces, but then also the experience of actually wearing it, if even only for a photograph. It's
yeah. I mean, that wearing those things and posing for a photograph was, even though the subject matter is quite dark and heavy, it actually felt like a really kind of fun thing to do, to wear those. And because it's a lot of what I was grappling with was, like why I think, like, I've looked at books of Victorian fashion and the intricacy and the shapes of the dresses, and thinking about, like, I've always been drawn to that and found it really, really beautiful. But it's also something that I was questioning, because for a long time I found it hard to see that kind of beauty in anything African that I would look at. Like, I would try and connect with African works of art, but I just didn't feel it. And starting to recognize, like, obviously that's, even though I felt a bit ashamed that I couldn't see as much beauty in African works of art as I could in European ones, obviously it's because I've been conditioned that way. Like, all our lives we've grown up with these, movies that are made of Jane Austen novels and like the sumptuous fabrics, and like we're basically taught that those are the most beautiful things. So I can't rid myself of that, even if I'd like to sometimes. I still find it really beautiful. And so, like it's not all a negative thing. Like when I put on those things, it was just really fun to kind of play with them and be a bit cheeky and say, okay, this is me. This is all of me, like the African and the European as well.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the photograph of you wearing them certainly communicates that. Absolutely. And I have to comment, yeah, when I think back on all the art history courses that were available to us at the time I went through, yes, it was very, very heavily. That's changing now, thank goodness. But yes, I think conditioning is the right word for that.
Yeah.
What happened there? Yes.
Yeah, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, because I think one of the most important things that we could do I don't know if we could ever eliminate racism, but if we were to try, would be to, like what if we could change all of the curriculum of K to 12 and university curricula to reflect the idea that all cultures and all people have the same value in our world. Like we pretend that we think they do, but the way that we teach, like if there were an African or indigenous storyteller who were just as talented as we have learned that Shakespeare was, how would we even know? Because we're not taught that, right? We're taught that Shakespeare is the height of storytelling and symbolism. And, like what if we created a curriculum where we're obviously, I think there's a lot of focus right now. We have to teach about the history of oppression so that we know that history, which is important too. But I also think, why can't we teach, like celebrate all cultures and not just certain aspects of them? Like what are their philosophies? If they don't have literature, what's their storytelling? What's the art, and how do we learn in the same way we learn to appreciate European art? How do we learn to appreciate art from other cultures? So
absolutely, I agree, and I think your work certainly helps in opening people's minds, and I think that's something that's very, very much needed.
thank you.
And also, I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the idea of the privilege that written text has been given for centuries, and yet the oral tradition is so strong and is meaningful also, and so I don't even know that we have to reconcile them. They can exist on their own and be meaningful in different ways. But that brought me to the whole idea of your titles.
Okay.
Yeah. So Warren, at what point? I mean, there are all these double entendres and metaphor. And at what point did you decide that that was going to be the title of the Victorian mourning dress?
I'm not even really sure anymore.
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
and
they
it's
become
hard
so
to even.
integrated at a certain point. They become so integrated and they can't be separated anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess because I was thinking a lot about our identities as something that we wear.
Yeah.
And that's in my more recent work as well. I'm thinking about that. Like, are we wearing our identities? Like, I know that we choose to wear certain aspects of it. Like, for example, if I'm wearing natural hair, I'm wearing basically that's an expression of how I choose for people to see me. But there are a lot of aspects of our identity that we don't choose to wear. Like, for example, if somebody looks at me and recognizes that I'm part African, they may automatically make the connection with slavery. And that's a part of my identity that obviously I'm exploring because it's been forced on me. But at some point I was wondering, are we wearing that identity, or is it African people that are bringing up that story over and over again because we want people to be aware of the history, or is it being forced on us that that's what the dominant culture wants to present as our history and who we are? And so, I mean, I think obviously I've leaned more towards the conclusion that although I think it's important, really important for people to understand that history, I don't think it should be the only thing that's attached to us. And sometimes it is the strongest imagery of who we are and who our identities are and how we're created. It's much stronger than someone looking at me and thinking about an African culture, because people don't really know anything about African culture. So I'm going on and on, but just to say that about identity being worn is like a major theme in my work. So
yeah, just briefly before we go on, the title "worn." I mean, the idea that it's a past participle, the past. So you're looking at the past. But I was wondering if part of that choice of making having the past participle as your title was also enough. We have to look forward.
Yeah. I don't see it as being specifically past. Like when I talk about it's something that is worn, meaning that I'm wearing it currently. But I also like the idea that it can mean like if something's worn, it's been kind of used a bit too much. You can say it's worn.
Yeah.
I like that aspect of it too. But yeah, definitely. I think obviously we're always moving forward.
Without forgetting the past.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Your body of work, which I'm referring to that group of items that you developed for NASCAD for your MFA. To what extent did that grow out of worn? I know the whole idea of identity and how you explore your personal identity and your racial identity. But if you could explain some of those, they're just incredibly powerful pieces, and I think it would put worn in context a bit.
Okay.
It would round out a bit more where you've been taking some of your ideas.
Yeah, so the series of objects that are called body of work are actually 8 neck pieces that I created. And when I made worn, as you probably mentioned in the introduction, I have a background in jewelry. So I was a goldsmith and a jewelry designer for 20 years and still am. I'm not as actively doing it right now. But when I started thinking, when I was doing my MFA in jewelry, I started thinking about all of these big ideas that are in worn and feeling like I couldn't really express them through jewelry. I kind of had this idea that I needed to make something bigger that would be able to be shown in a contemporary art gallery so that people would be thinking about the ideas, and was moving towards other mediums to find an expression of that. And so those were the ideas with the hair and the textiles that I was working on in my first year of the MFA. I actually took a 4-year leave from the MFA program to take a job in Vancouver. And then when I went back for my second year, I had really determined that I wanted to take on the challenge of trying to express some bigger ideas through jewelry, because that really is the medium that I know best. And I couldn't help noticing the parallels between seeing these images of enslaved people wearing these awful shackles and implements of torture and restraint. And I couldn't help seeing the parallel between those metal objects fitted to the body and then the metal objects that I had been creating throughout my career. Although those restraints were often in steel and I was often working in precious materials like silver and gold, but I kind of wanted to put those two things together, and also thinking about how identity is worn. As I mentioned, I was thinking about, do we wear it intentionally or is it forced on us? So I wanted to make these pieces that looked like restraints, but they also were not, you could take them off, like the steel collar with the corn attached to it. It has leather ties, so you can take it off. It's not actually locked onto your neck.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I wanted to face the challenge of, because part of my goal was to create objects that were somehow jewelry but could be shown in a contemporary art setting. So I mounted them on the black panels because I knew that a lot of galleries don't have a means of showing jewelry. They may not have display cases, and if it's in a display case, that brings in a whole other set of meanings. So I wanted to create something that people could think about. They're mounted at neck height so that you can sort of imagine yourself wearing it, or you can imagine facing the absent person that may have worn it.
Again, it's one of those really amazing experiences when you feel that tension in looking at your work. It's that tension between just that aesthetic, that first sort of aesthetic understanding and glance, and then really understanding actually what the meaning of that object is. That must have been very, very difficult for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was really hard to make that work. Like I was reading a novel, rereading a novel at the time called The Known World, and I wasn't able to finish it that second time because it's about slavery and it's just too painful to read. And during that time when I was making those pieces, it was just really emotional. Like I was crying all the time, basically. And yeah, it was hard. It was hard, but I mean, I'm glad that I did it because obviously it is really a strong expression about some kind of really intense emotions that I feel. And
did you find it somewhat cathartic?
Yeah, I think I did. Yeah, I do feel like I have come to terms with. I mean, you can't never come to terms with the pain of that, but also one of the ideas that I was working with again about to do with shame. The corn kernels that so the first piece that I made was called Yoke, and it was a steel collar with corn kernels adorning it. And that actually has quite a complex meaning that you wouldn't know from looking at it. But basically, when I was doing all of that soul searching during my MFA, I was quite shocked to find that there was a certain emotion that I would get that I finally identified as shame when I would see images of Africans, and it really was attached to, like growing up in the dominant white culture and, having been not being taught directly, but inferring as a very young child, that being African is really something that is considered shameful. And so those corn kernels, it was like this thing that just came up every now and then, this feeling of shame that I finally identified. And I actually came to see it as a little hard kernel because I identified it as, sometimes if you have a rock in your shoe, a little rock, you can walk 100 steps without feeling it, but then when it gets in the right position, you feel a twinge. So that's how I felt about that shame. It was something that I wasn't always feeling, but it would come up every now and then. So I started to visualize it as this little hard kernel somewhere floating around within me. And that I wanted to bring it out to the surface. And so that's kind of the hidden meaning of those corn kernels. The more surface meaning is more about referring to agriculture and the foods that enslaved people would have been given to eat, and the fact that a lot of Europeans still see corn as like a food that's only fit for livestock. I've heard that from Germans, from British people. So there are all kinds, again, of things that have symbols that have multiple meanings, and bringing that out to the surface actually has helped me to recognize it and not, not be ashamed of the fact that I feel this shame, because we're often taught we need to be proud of who we are. And so that feeling of shame is almost like a double shame, right? So.
Well, yes. I obviously I can't be in your shoes, but I understand what you're saying. And but I'd like to say that I think it's our privilege to hear you and to see your art.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for it and for what.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much for, like, I really just have appreciated the support that the ROM has given me and the opportunity to show my work to a larger audience. And I love the fact that when I hear that Warren is often shown to school groups, because I really like the idea that my work is an entry point for people to start thinking about contemporary art at a young age.
I have to say, I see people around it all the time. When I go into the gallery, there are always people looking at it and looking at it very intently.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Great.
It's really great to see, and it's our pleasure to have it in the collection. So thank you very much.
Thank you.